Hi, welcome back to my channel. Today's video is a conversation that I shared with my good friend Katrina. She is a grief and loss advocate who has spent the last few years sharing her story with others to make an uncomfortable conversation more comfortable. She has a podcast called Grow with Grief and she actively posts on her Instagram page. Today's conversation dives into the many forms of grief and how we have to learn to live with it, as well as touching on her personal life and how she handled moving from the UK to Australia and then having a global pandemic. Stay tuned for today's conversation. It honestly was so amazing, and I cannot wait to hear your feedback from this one. Hi, how are you, Katrina?
I am good, thank you. How are you?
Really, really well, thank you. Have you had much time for today?
I'm just working today, so I'm taking a little bit of time out just so that I can have this conversation with you, which I'm really excited about. And then I'll probably head to the beach tonight and just have a little stroll with the dog. Yeah.
Yes, love that so much. Thank you so much for taking this time out of your day for me. I do appreciate that so much. So great that we can connect like this, and especially now, virtually makes it so much easier. And I do love a good beach walk in the evening. So definitely that sounds like a beautiful evening. So I guess we're here today to have a bit of a conversation about your journey so far and the last 12 months. If you don't mind, I will get you just to, I guess, tell me a little bit about yourself for those who don't know you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, where to start? There's so much. I'll try and keep it short. I am 26 years old. I'm originally from England, but I currently live in Melbourne, Australia. So the weather's kind of similar, not too different. But I have lived here for a year and a half now with my partner Will and our little rescue dog Ronnie. Aside from that, I myself am a grief and loss advocate and speaker. So I like to refer to myself as a storyteller. The other day I got called the grief girl, which I kind of was really proud about. And I essentially hold space for people to be able to express their grief, talk about their grief, and share their stories of grief whilst also sharing my own. I really want to start that conversation around a topic that isn't spoken about enough in society and is classed as a bit of a taboo subject. So for me, my passion and my purpose is opening up that conversation so that the uncomfortable no longer feels uncomfortable. So that is what I do. That is me. And I also work part-time as an admin officer as well.
Amazing. I love that so much. I love the way that you speak about it so passionately, and you're right, it is a very kind of taboo subject, but just saying just then you got called the grief girl, and that for some people sounds very dark and morbid, but like you said, you loved it, you thought it was great, and that way your message is also being spoken about, people are recognizing you and they're not afraid to speak to you about those things. How do you find, I guess, having those kind of conversations? Grief takes many forms. It's not just the death of a loved one or death of someone it takes many ebbs and flows throughout the journey, and I guess it's something that is always ongoing. It's not something that you simply get over. And do you find that is kind of a subject that people are like kind of expecting, like, so when does this end? Do you get that question, like, when is this gonna be done? When am I gonna stop grieving? When am I gonna stop feeling this way? Do you find that to be a common question?
Yeah, definitely. So it's something that a lot of people ask. It's something that I asked myself. So just for a bit of backstory, when I was 15, my mum passed away from cancer. She'd been ill for about 2 years. Following that, 4 years ago, my nephew passed away from sepsis. He was only 5 days old. And then I've also had friends and family and relatives around me that have also passed away. So grief has been a big aspect of my life, a big aspect of my friend's life as well. And I just want to make it clear that up until 2-3 years ago, I actually never spoke about this stuff very openly. And I don't want anybody who is listening into this who maybe is experiencing grief or knows somebody who is experiencing grief to think that it's just something that you can talk about super easy, because quite often, more often than not anyway, it can take some time to get to this point. And we all take different amounts of time to reach a point where we feel open to enough to be able to speak about it. Sometimes we may never get there, and that's fine as well. Sometimes we might never want to talk about it. So I just want to make that clear before we start this conversation, because I'd hate for anybody to look at me and think, oh my gosh, I should be talking about it like she is, because not everybody can, not everybody wants to, and that's fine. In regards to the question of when does it end, yes, we get that question a lot. I get that question a lot. A lot of other people in the community get it too. And I think the main reason that people ask this question is because there are so many misunderstandings and platitudes out there in the world that suggest there is a time frame. You know, everybody knows of the 5 stages of grief. And this is a theory that was designed by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. But actually, when she was designing this theory and put these stages together, she was designing it for people who were facing their own death. So people with terminal illness that were facing their own death, they knew that it was coming. It wasn't actually in reference to people who were left behind and people that were grieving and left behind. So those 5 stages of grief, whilst they can be a helpful reference for some people, they also shouldn't be taken as the rule of thumb, because that is not the way that grief works. It does not follow a linear process. It does not go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and you're done. Most often you will feel all 5 emotions that are referenced in those 5 stages at various different points in your life, sometimes all within one day or within 1 hour. So there's this big misconception out there that grief has a time frame, and therefore if you've never experienced grief in your life, that is what you expect. You expect a year to pass and you to no longer feel these feelings and for grief to finish. But unfortunately, that is not the way that it works. Grief is something that we live alongside our whole life, and sometimes it may feel more present than other days. It could go weeks and months without it feeling overwhelming, and then something can happen and it triggers that memory or that thought process, and you're right back in the feelings of grief that you maybe had in the first hour after somebody died. So grief does not have a timeline, and it sounds so horrible to say. It kind of sounds, I think a lot of people sometimes, especially if they've not experienced grief, will think that it's just morbid of me to say it never ends, it's constantly ongoing. But realistically, it comes in waves. As I said, you know, it comes up at different points in your life, maybe big milestones that you have, a certain amount of time that has passed. Sometimes you don't even need those significant dates or moments. It can be something as small as watching an advert on telly that reminds you of that person, and your grief resurfaces again. So it is with you your whole life, and it lives alongside you. So I always like to say, you don't get over grief, you move forward with it. You don't move on, you move forward. And it just takes people different amounts of time before they feel that they're able to start moving forward with their grief. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
No, I love that. It's such good advice for those who may be listening. And I think when you mentioned about the 5 stages, I was not aware of that. I didn't know that it was for people, or originally had originated for people that were dying, not for those who had been left behind. So I think, you know, that is a really good thing to know and learn, that yeah, you're not expected just to hit all 5 stages. There's many more stages to that, and as you just said, you move forward with grief. You don't just get over grief. So I think that is such good advice. You said earlier as well, you only started feeling comfortable speaking about this 2 to 3 years ago. Can I ask what changed? What made you feel more comfortable? What made you start wanting to be this advocate for grief?
See, I get asked this question a lot, and I find it very hard to pinpoint the one moment. I guess in different areas of my life, I've been more open than others. With my friends and my family, I started maybe speaking to them about it first, and then I started speaking more openly about it when friends were coming to me because they were experiencing grief, and they just wanted to ask a couple of questions, and I was able to speak with them. And I realized that through speaking about it to my friends and family, I started to feel a bit lighter. I started to realize that I wasn't the only one feeling the way that I was feeling, because for a very long time, I didn't openly talk about it because I thought that my emotions, my thoughts were abnormal. And the fact that 6 years on, I was still feeling the way that I was the day my mum passed away. So I didn't speak about it for so long because of that. And then what really changed for me was, as I said, those small moments, opening up about it a little bit more with those that I trusted. And then the time after my nephew passed away. So when my nephew passed away, I saw the profound impact that it had on my sister. And I guess at this point I was a little bit older. I was 22. So I was a lot more aware of what was going on. I guess I was a bit more emotionally intelligent and aware of other people's emotions as well. And I could see the avoidance that my sister was met with in terms of her own grief. So people wanting to avoid the topic, people saying things that maybe weren't helpful or were quite painful, even though they were well intentioned. And I started to recognize that a lot of these things that people understood about grief were just completely wrong, and that I wasn't the only one that felt this way. I wasn't the only one to feel alone and to feel isolated in it. And the more conversations I then started to have, I decided I wanted to open that up with a wider community. I didn't want to hold back anymore, because I didn't want anybody else to feel the way that I felt for those first 6 years after my mum died. And I didn't want anybody else to feel the way that my sister felt. And not only that, shortly after my nephew passed away, my granddad also had a stroke and lost his ability to speak. And that in itself was a form of grief for him. He had to grieve his independence. There was so much he could no longer do. He could not communicate. And it was already difficult because of a language barrier, as my granddad is German. And I am a bit ashamed to say that I have still not learned German fluently, although I do know the odd words. I can have a basic conversation. That whole possibility was just gone. So all together, we all had to process this grief of my nephew, had to process this grief of my granddad, and I just had enough, quite simply. And the more that I spoke about it, the more I realized that people resonated with it, and the more I realized it helped people. And that is all I have ever really wanted to do from a very young age. I've always been interested in a career or a job that helps people. So for a very long time, I wanted to be a vet because I wanted to help animals. Then I wanted to work in the charity sector because I wanted to help people. Then I wanted to be a teacher because I wanted to help kids. So I've always been very centered around serving others. And this was a way that I could serve others and share my own experiences and help people was something that I was really, really passionate about. So, yeah.
No, I love that so much. It's you honestly, I feel like we could speak about this topic for ages, like hours, honestly. Like it goes into so many different avenues, and like you just mentioned as well, like do you call him your Opa, or do you call him Pop? Opa, yeah. Part German too. So, you know what I mean? Your Opa losing his ability to speak, like that is huge. And even like in my own experiences, even currently, and it's totally left field to this, but since my surgery, I thought I was going to have complete independence after my spinal fusion, and I'm still struggling 2 years on. You know what I mean? And like having my independence or having to be waited on hand and foot was so difficult for me. And it's like, and I could imagine, in your mind, you think you can do it and you're just like, can this be over, please? I want to go back to how things were. But it's like you mentioned earlier, you have to move forward with it. You have to grow with it. You know what I mean? It's not going to be like it used to be. Your life has changed forever, and you have to be able to work around that now. And it's something that I think a lot of people get stuck in the past, and that what causes bitterness and causes that grief to prolong and makes things harder. And I definitely know that I've had moments where, I'm like, why me? Why is this happening? X, Y, Z. Like there's so many different things in my mind that I'm thinking of right now, whether it's grieving a person, grieving a circumstance, grieving a relationship. You know what I mean? Like you can grieve things that are still with you and still living, but no longer part of your life. And that is, I think, yeah, I'm just like, my mind is absolutely blown right now by the amount of things that you do have to move through, and people don't call it grief.
Yeah.
They
And
don't, you know what I mean? They just say,
I think there's two really important things to mention there. And the first one is the fact that pain is inevitable, but suffering is a choice. And when I read this for the first time, I was like, oh shit, like it hit me, like it really, really hit home. But it is so true. You know, pain is going to come into our life in some form, and that's okay. Don't shy away from that, and don't deny it either. It does happen. It is inevitable, as I said, but prolonging that pain is a choice, and it can be quite confronting to hear. But for example, with me, I, for so long, made the conscious decision that I did not want to speak about how I was feeling. I did not want to face the pain and the fact that my mum had died, and it was so disgustingly painful. I decided to numb that pain with alcohol. I decided to restrict myself with food. I decided to inflict that pain on myself, and ultimately I decided to take that attempt on my life. And that was me prolonging my suffering. So when I say that pain is inevitable and suffering is a choice, it sounds very confronting, but it's very, very true. And quite often we inflict that suffering for a lot longer than it needs to be. You know,
yes.
It's good that we allow ourselves to feel that pain. It's good that we allow ourselves to feel those emotions, but it's finding a way of not ruminating it for so long that it damages you, and that it damages your everyday life. And then the second thing is what you mentioned about how grief isn't just for death. You know, there's so many different aspects of grief, and this is something that is spoken about a lot in the grief community, and I guess a little bit of controversy. So I want to kind of underline this with the fact that all grief is valid, but not all grief is the same. So there are many different forms of grief. There's different things that you can grieve over. So you can grieve a person, you can grieve a circumstance, you can grieve a life change, something that was, something that would have been. And there's also different ways that grief can show up in your life as well. So for example, perhaps you're grieving, there's like something called secondary loss. So when you grieve a person, you then also grieve all of the things that would have happened should that person still be here, but then they're taken away. You can also experience something called ambiguous loss or ambiguous grief, and this is when you are grieving somebody that's still there. So perhaps you've experienced a divorce, perhaps you know that somebody is terminally ill and they may no longer be here, perhaps it's the breakdown of a relationship or a friendship. So there's many different forms that grief can take, and I think it's really important to note that, but it's also important to know that not all grief is the same. So you and I may have both experienced the loss of a person through death. That does not mean that it is the same. It does not mean that I understand you, and it does not mean that you understand me. It means that maybe we can relate or empathize with less judgment, and with no judgment in fact, but it does not mean they are the same. Just as if one person may have experienced the loss of a pet and another person may have experienced the breakdown of a relationship, they're still valid, but they're not the same. So I think that's really important to know that all grief is valid, but we should also recognize that just because we may have been through something even if it's very, very similar, it is not the same. And each person's grief is individual to them, and it is valid no matter what.
Yeah, I love that so much, definitely. It all comes down to perspective as well, and your experiences in life. You know, everybody processes things differently. They experience things differently. And like you said, you might have, like you had a death of a parent, and as the group that we worked in, you know, you related to girls who also had a death of a parent, but all your circumstances were different. The way you grieved was different. You know, it was, although very similar, you could relate, like you mentioned, but like you said, no two things were the same. And I think that's really important to know. And I love that all grief is valid, although it is different. Because yeah, I can 100% say I've not experienced anything as heart-wrenching, I could say, as losing a parent, although I have lost people in my life. And I, when we first met, I remember speaking and just, honestly, I'm getting like just welling up just hearing your story, because I, like, although I have not experienced it, I empathize with the pain because I have felt a loss of someone else, but I could only imagine how much stronger it would be for you. So like you said, that no judgment, and just, empathizing with people. Speaking of that and empathy and no judgment, and I know you've been asked this question before, those who are feeling like me, I get very sometimes awkward with people who are grieving or who've lost someone. How would have you liked to be spoken to about, I guess, like you said earlier, when your sister lost her son and was asking, kind of getting told, or they were saying the wrong things. They were, they were trying to help, but they weren't really helping. What would you suggest for people that have a friend who is grieving? How would you suggest that they be there for them?
Yeah. This is a really big question, and I don't think there's any right answer, because each person will appreciate different support in different ways. So it's quite tricky, but in general, what I would say is just don't be afraid of actually speaking about it. And quite often the reason that we come out with things that maybe in hindsight are a little bit insensitive or could be hurtful is because we're so worried about what we're actually going to say. And quite often then, when we're so worried about what we're going to say, we don't say anything at all. And now I can tell you that every single griever that I've spoken to, they remember that one person that said nothing, and that hurts. It hurts when the fact that you've lost something so big in your life and it has caused you this much pain that people just ignore it. And so I would say the first thing that you can do is acknowledge it. Acknowledge it. So if your friend is experiencing grief, specifically and particularly around the death of a loved one, then just acknowledge that it's happened. Say to them, I know this has happened and it sucks and it's hard and I'm sorry that it happened. Acknowledge it. The second thing I would say is don't put any assumptions or tell them how they should grieve. Quite often you get hit with things like your mum wouldn't want you to be sad, or you should be over it by now, or why not try this really helped me, or you need to look on the brighter side. All of these things, telling them what to do doesn't help. Encourage them to express their grief in a healthy, safe way that feels right for them, and allow them to do so. Don't stop them from doing that. Don't stop them from being upset. If they feel angry, let them be angry. If they need to just sit and curl up in a ball, sit up and curl in a ball with them. Allow them to feel what they need to feel.
Yeah, I think that's good advice for life though as well. Like even you're just saying then, if they're upset, let them be upset. I think so many times I might just be upset for a reason and I get told, oh, why are you upset? Don't be upset. Don't cry. It's like, and you get taught from a young age to suppress. You should be this way, not that way. And I think that's really good advice, not just for those who are grieving, but I think for everyone out there.
Definitely. It served me well in other areas of my life.
Yes, definitely. I think kind of on a left field subject, but I think those who have experienced deep grief, and if they can work through expressing those emotions, I think would be healthier in the long run compared to someone like myself who has suppressed negative emotions because I was told don't cry, don't be sad, be a happy child, things like that. So all expression of emotions are valid and you should feel comfortable doing it, and there's nothing wrong with you if you want to cry and roll up in a ball even if nothing's going wrong. I want to put that out there.
That is a wider issue in society, is that we believe that there's good emotions and there's bad emotions, and we categorize them and we put them into a box. So crying, feeling angry, feeling sad, feeling frustrated, they're all bad emotions. Laughing, smiling, having a joke, feeling comfortable, they're all good emotions, when actually all emotions are just on a spectrum. All emotions are important, it's important that we feel all of them, because if we don't feel sadness, if I've never felt sadness, I would not know what happiness is. And if I never felt pure joy, I would never know what absolute despair and pain felt like. So it's a complete spectrum, and it's important that we recognize them and can recognize them in ourselves, and not feel that we just have to squash them down to make other people feel comfortable. We should all feel comfortable not only in expressing our own emotions, but allowing others to express theirs too. And there's a really big thing in society that in grief, that grief is a bad emotion. Grief is something that we have to move through really fast. Grief is something that we have to get over. Grief is something that we can't sit and just be with. And therefore, because we've categorized it into this bad category, people, when they're experiencing grief, feel like they just have to get over it. They have to just literally just be over it within a week. You know, you've got the 3 days leave that you're allowed from work, it's some bereavement leave. You've got all of the platitudes. You've got all of these people saying, you know, you need to be up and happy. That's not the way that it works. And instead of categorizing grief as a bad emotion, why don't we just accept that it's a normal response? Grief is a normal physical, emotional, psychological response to loss. And it shouldn't be made to feel like it's this abnormal thing that we shouldn't be experiencing. It's a completely normal response, and it's healthy to feel the grief. In fact, it's healthy to feel it. I know from times when I tried to suppress my grief, so I tried to push it down so hard that I ended up causing more pain for myself and those around me, because I reached a point where I didn't know where else to turn. I didn't think I had any other. I tried every avenue to squash this grief down, to get it out of my life. I didn't want it. I didn't want to feel it. I didn't want to see it. But nothing stopped me from feeling it. So the only option I felt I had was to end my life, because I didn't see any other way, because it just kept coming up. Because that's what it's going to do. It's a natural response. It's a response that your body needs to feel when you experience a loss, a profound loss. So yeah, not suppressing how people feel is really, really important in all aspects of life, but particularly in grief. And then I guess the final most important thing that you can do for friends, just don't, if you're thinking...
I know we kind of went on a big loop just then.
Did a loop around. But the most important thing as well is, I guess the third thing I would highlight is, if you're thinking of saying anything that starts with the words "at least," just don't let those words exit your mouth. Because there is no "at least." You know, at least she was older, at least you got to spend all this time, at least you can have more kids, at least you're young and you can remarry. Like, all of these things do not take away from the profound loss that we have experienced. It's still painful. So please just try and avoid those words. And then lastly, I would say, ask your friend what they need. You know, they might not know. Quite often, especially in the early stages of your grief and the early days, you don't know. You know, you can't look after yourself. You don't know what you want. You don't know what you need, because it's all new to you. But don't be afraid to ask. Say, I don't know how I can support you, but I want to support you. When you feel able to tell me what you need, please do tell me. Or you can just simply say, would it help you if I made you dinner tonight? Would it help if I took the kids out? Would it help if I came and did that ironing for you? Would it help if I came and just sat in silence? Would you like me to check in on you every day? You don't have to text back. It's those little things that let people know that you're there that can really, really be helpful. And then when they feel able to ask you, they will ask. They might never ask. Don't be offended by that. Don't think, you know, I'm offering all these things and she's rejecting them, or he's rejecting them. Don't take it as an insult. People are trying to process their own pain, but by letting them know that you're there, that honestly speaks 1,000 words. And that they are the things and they are the moments that people remember.
Thank you so much for watching today. Please like, subscribe, comment, let me know how you found this video. Let me know what information you got from this, and keep an eye out for part 2.